Good evening. The Multimedia Museum of the New Chronology continues its series of lectures with the founders of the New Chronology. Today, with Anatoly Fomenko, we will discuss the methods of dating the ancient and medieval events offered by mathematical statistics developed by Anatoly Fomenko from 1973 to 1979. Anatoly Timofeyevich. Hello.
Hello, colleagues.
Anatoly Timofeyevich, in our previous conversation, you mentioned that nowadays the existing dating methods, including natural scientific ones, are not absolute. If we use these methods exclusively, it is impossible to obtain precise dating. Please tell us about your proprietary methods and their application in researching ancient history.
Now, I want to briefly and as visually as possible explain the methods I developed, both individually and later in collaboration with my colleagues, including Gleb Nosovsky, for dating events described in ancient sources. As mentioned earlier, in the study of chronology, it became clear that we need to rely on objective methods. Not on the interpretation of names, not on the interpretation of events, but on objectively verifiable ways of determining dates using some numerical parameters that can be extracted from ancient chronicles. I will say now that we work with written sources, that is, sources that contain narrative written information. There are several methods, and I won't talk about all of them. They are described in our books. I will briefly tell you about three of them. One method, which I proposed, relies on the so-called volume functions of chronicles. What is it? It's a simple thing. Ancient chronicles are structured as follows. Dates are listed, and for each date, events that, according to the chronicler, happened in those years are recorded. Thus, one can calculate the volume of text dedicated to each year. For example, one can count the number of lines that describe a particular year or the number of characters. The unit of measurement here is not essential. Thus, by going along the chronicle in which the years are listed, we obtain a set of numbers, namely the volumes of descriptions of those years. It's possible to create a graph. On the time axis, we place the dates mentioned in the chronicle, and on the vertical axis, we plot numbers equal to the volumes dedicated to specific years. You get a graph. Such graphs are shown, for example, in this illustration. These are graphs of the volumes of two chronicles that describe the same era, depending on the year. It turns out that this information is very useful and can be used for dating events. Let's think about it. Consider, let's call it, the primary information fund. From year A to year B, a certain number of documents were written each year. Numbers appear, the volumes of documents created in the years distributed within the interval from A to B. This result is a graph of the primary information fund. Over time, information is lost. Documents disappear, chronicles perish, burn in fires. Therefore, the volume graph will, of course, decrease and deform in some way. And if we look at how much text has survived to us in a fixed year t, this volume will be less than the original volume of information. Nevertheless, we can formulate the following model, hypothesis, that the years in which many documents were written will have more surviving documents. In other words, the local maxima of these graphs should be close. The amplitude, that is, the height of these graphs, will, of course, decrease over time, somewhat unevenly. But on average, in the years where contemporaries recorded a lot of texts, there was a surge, a local maximum, and more will remain from those years. Therefore, the model looks like this. When a chronicler, who is no longer a contemporary of those events and lives later than the period from year A to year B, wants to write a chronicle of those events, he will naturally turn to libraries, gather the documents that have survived to his time, and based on them, write his chronicle. It is natural to assume, and this is a hypothesis, a model, that he will write more about the years from which a lot of text has reached him, and less or nothing at all about the years from which little or no text has reached him. If we now create a volume graph for the chronicle created by this chronicler, we will find that the peaks, that is, the local maxima of this graph, occur approximately in the same years where the original information fund had peaks, created by contemporaries of that distant period from A to B. This hypothesis, this model, has been tested. I have tested it on many real chronicles, both ancient and medieval, and on texts from our time, on modern textbooks as well. We can certainly look at modern history textbooks as some chronicles that describe events over a certain time interval from year A to year B. It turns out that this model is confirmed. For all cases where we know the datings, and the events are correctly dated, we see that the peaks of the chronicle coincide with the points where the original information fund had peaks. This leads to a very useful consequence, providing one of the dating methods. Let's consider two chronicles, X and Y. Suppose we know that they describe events from the same historical period. According to the model previously mentioned, the points of these peaks should be close. Conversely, if the two chronicles are independent and describe events from different eras, then if we align the time intervals they describe on the time axis, the points of local peaks will be far apart. They do not correlate, they are dissimilar and do not reproduce each other. This model has also been tested. A large number of pairs of dependent texts known a priori that describe the same historical period were compiled, as well as pairs of a priori independent texts describing events from different eras. Their volume functions and graphs were calculated and compared. The model was confirmed. Indeed, for cases where the chronicles were dependent, their peaks occurred approximately at the same time on the time axis. And when the chronicles were independent, their peaks did not correlate in any way. Thus, a dating method arises. How does it work? Let me briefly formulate the model again. If two chronicles are evidently dependent, i.e., they describe the same flow of historical events from year A to year B in the history of the same country, the volume graphs of these chronicles should simultaneously reach local maxima, i.e., have peaks in the interval from A to B. Conversely, if these texts are independent, their peaks do not correlate. I want to show a few examples, a few graphs of chronicles that are undoubtedly dependent, where it is evident that the points of their peaks occur in roughly the same years, and undoubtedly independent ones, where it is evident that the points of the peaks fall on years that do not correlate with each other. This methodology has been applied to date real ancient texts. For example, as a prominent example, the works of the famous ancient historian Titus Livius were analyzed. His text contains a distribution of events by years. And the second text is from the well-known historian of the Middle Ages Ferdinand Gregorovius of the 19th century, who wrote a voluminous work on the history of ancient Rome. These are two texts discussing the history of Rome. One is considered ancient, and the other is considered belonging to the Middle Ages. This is a 19th century author. However, he gathered chronicles from the history of medieval Rome, starting from the beginning of the Common Era to approximately the 16th century AD. Graphs of the distribution of volumes of these chronicles by year were constructed, and it turned out that they correlate well with each other. According to our model, they are actually talking about events from the same era and the same country. This simply means that events of ancient Rome are overlapping with events of medieval Rome. This is a shift upwards by several hundred years. Moreover, this result was obtained not by comparing descriptions of events but by analyzing purely formal numerical statistical parameters of these texts, which gives this result an objective character, and it can be rechecked. And it is objective in nature. Then this method was applied to other texts, and it was found that many texts considered ancient today actually correlate well in terms of their volume graphs with texts that describe events from the Middle Ages. Thus, these texts, and consequently the events described in them, move up from the ancient era, shifting by several hundred years, and align with various periods in the history of the Middle Ages. This allows us to reconsider chronology and construct a new objective chronology based not on subjective considerations but on objective methods and calculations. This is the first method, which I conditionally call the method of correlation of local maxima. The second method. Also briefly, without delving into mathematical details, I will try to explain the essence and idea of this method. I have provisionally named it the frequency damping principle. It describes the chronologically correct order of generation chapters in a chronicle. What is a generation chapter? Well, it's a simple concept. Take an ancient chronicle and divide it into fragments where each fragment roughly talks about events of one generation of characters. On average, this is usually around 30 years, after which generations change. Children, fathers, grandchildren, grandfathers, great-grandfathers. Let's call these fragment, generation chapters. So, with the correct numbering of generation chapters, when transitioning from describing one generation to the next, the chronicler changes the characters. Specifically, when describing earlier generations, generations with a certain number, Q, for example, he says nothing about the characters of that generation because they have not been born yet. Then, when describing generation Q, the chronicler will talk the most about the characters of that specific generation since the events he is describing are directly related to them. Finally, when moving on to describe the next generations, the chronicler mentions the previous characters less and less as he describes new events with characters who replace those who have died. In short, this model, which I want to reiterate once again, can be formulated as follows. Each generation gives birth to new historical figures. As generations change, these figures also change. This seems like a simple idea, but it also needs verification to see if it holds true. This was done. Quite a few, several dozen historical texts, including ancient, medieval, and modern ones, were processed. It turned out that this model is confirmed. Frequency graphs were created, showing how and in what quantity characters born in older generations are mentioned in later eras. It was found that indeed, as one moves further away from a fixed generation, mentions of characters born in that generation decrease more and more and eventually become minimal because the chronicler is now talking about new people born later, and the main events are now associated with them. This frequency damping principle formed the basis of the methodology for dating events. It was found that this methodology is confirmed in texts that contain a priori correct ordering of generation chapters, without repetitions. In cases where there were repetitions in the text, i.e., a return to the description of old characters and old events, this methodology showed that spikes appeared for the corresponding graphs. These spikes allowed the detection of these duplicates. In essence, the method is designed to identify duplicates in texts. Let's say we have a chronicle that describes events over a long period of time. We divide the chronicle into generation chapters, create frequency graphs, and look for any strange recurring spikes. As it turned out, if they exist, this indicates the presence of duplicates in the chronicle. Two texts have made their way into the chronicle, placed in different parts of the chronicle, but they talk about events from the same era and the same people. These duplicates can have different names. Not necessarily when these events are repeated, these people have the same names they had in the first chronicle. The second chronicle could name them completely differently. Therefore, during a casual review of the chronicle, you won't notice that there are event repetitions. However, our method will reveal this because the frequency graphs will unequivocally indicate that a group of characters, who supposedly lived long ago, unexpectedly reappears several hundred years later in another epoch. Even though the names are different, the fact of their reappearance will be detected using our methodology. This methodology was applied to many important ancient texts, including the Bible. The Bible is one of the most important historical texts, an extensive chronicle. It mentions thousands of characters, there are many names. A fundamental analysis and study of the Bible were conducted. Matrices of name repetitions and reference repetitions in the Bible were created over several years of painstaking work by my parents, Valentina Polikarpovna Fomenko and Timofey Grigorievich Fomenko. At that time, there were no computers yet. They compiled extensive and perfectly accurate matrices of mentions with frequencies for all names in the Bible, all parallel passages in the Bible, and all references in the Bible. This vast material, spanning several volumes, was subjected to the duplicate search method using the frequency damping principle. It was discovered that, indeed, there are duplicates in the Bible, repetitions that were known previously. For example, the books of Chronicles and the books of Kings are well-known duplicates. They are placed in different parts of the Bible but talk about the same events. Of course, these duplicates were found using our formal method of frequency damping analysis. So, the method confirmed its effectiveness. It found previously known biblical duplicates acknowledged by all historians. However, this same method uncovered new duplicates in the Bible, previously unknown, which had not previously attracted attention. There were quite a few of them. These are very distinct duplicates, no less prominent than the duplicates of the books of Chronicles and the books of Kings. These duplicates showed that in the Bible there were shifts and repetitions. To reconstruct the correct chronology, it is necessary to significantly compress the interval described in the Bible by identifying the found duplicates with each other. As a result, the chronology of the Bible is compressed, and the events described in the Bible actually fit into a shorter interval spanning a few hundred years, as opposed to thousands of years as it is commonly believed now. Here is an important example of using the methodology for duplicates search, name analysis, parallel passages analysis, applied, for instance, to the Bible. I can show you the results of processing the Bible on this slide. It details where various duplicates were found. They are characterized by these black clusters of dots on this graph. In brief, I'll explain another methodology focused on the analysis of descriptions of ancient and medieval royal dynasties. The point is that many chronicles typically provide more or less detailed accounts of the reigns of various kings and the chronology of their reigns. Usually chronicles tell how many years certain kings reigned. Sure, there may be discrepancies where different chroniclers assign different dates and durations to the reign of the same king. However, as experiments have shown and as the analysis of this large numerical material has demonstrated, on average, chroniclers did not have significant objective reasons to distort the duration of reigns of the kings. Therefore, this material can be the basis for another methodology, namely, dating ancient dynasties based on the distribution of kings' reign durations in these dynasties. Once again, in modern sources and chronicles that have come down to us from the distant past, there are many repetitions, many duplicates. Many chroniclers talk about events from the same era and the same kings. Naturally, such chronicles can be considered dependent, meaning they describe events from the same era. We considered chronicles independent if they discussed events from different eras or different countries at different times. Another model, a hypothesis based on mathematics and statistics, was formulated. I've tentatively named it small dynastic distortions principle. In short, without going into mathematical details, it sounds like this. If two dynasties in the chronicles differ only slightly, they usually represent the same real royal dynasty. In other words, they are two variations of its description in different chronicles. In these cases, the dynasties in the chronicles can be considered dependent. On the contrary, if two dynasties in the chronicles represent different real dynasties, they significantly differ from each other. In this case, we considered them independent. The remaining pairs of dynasties we called neutral. After that, the following work was carried out. Through a substantial and non-trivial effort, a numerical coefficient, a measure, was found for any pair of chronological dynasties. This number is calculated based on the reign durations attributed by chroniclers to the kings of these two compared dynasties. It turned out that this coefficient, which we found, and its search was highly non-trivial, effectively distinguishes between dependent and independent dynasties. When we calculated it for pairs of a priori dependent chronicle dynasties, it turned out to be very small, very insignificant in magnitude. Conversely, when the coefficient was calculated for pairs of a priori independent dynasties, it turned out to be large, orders of magnitude larger than the coefficient for dependent dynasties. This fact, which is the result of a significant and extensive statistical experiment, provides a basis for creating a dating methodology. Indeed, let's say we have found a previously unknown dynasty in some chronicles that we want to date. How can we do that? We need to consider a set of dynasties that we have already well dated, calculate the coefficient we found, and evaluate it. If it is small, then this pair of dynasties is dependent. And we get an argument in favor of the fact that the new dynasty we're interested in coincides or is close to the one we already know. This way, we date the description of this document. However, if the coefficient turns out to be too large, it means that these two dynasties are independent, and we should continue searching in hope of finding a close chronological dynasty that we have already dated. This method was applied to a large number of dynasties extracted from chronicles. It yielded unexpected results. It turned out that many ancient dynasties, that is, dynasties of rulers dating back to antiquity, before the Common Era, and the Middle Ages, before the 10th–12th centuries AD, and the late dynasties of kings who lived and ruled starting from the 12th century AD to the 17th century AD, were dependent. In simple terms, these supposedly ancient dynasties move upward, shift in time by hundreds, sometimes thousands of years, and overlap with the known dynasties of kings who lived and ruled in the Middle Ages, in the period roughly from the 12th to the 17th century AD. Here, I want to show quite a few graphs that demonstrate the comparison of ancient and medieval dynasties. These are duplicates, meaning these dynasties in the Chronicles actually represent the same real dynasty from the Middle Ages. There are quite a few of them, and I won't list them all now. Those interested can view these slides or refer to our books. For example, my book, Numbers Against Lies, in which these discovered dynasties are enumerated with detailed commentary, references, and information on how the dates of their reigns and activities were calculated by chroniclers. So, in brief, that's our third methodology, the method of dating ancient dynasties.
Anatoly Timofeyevich, could you please tell us what conclusions you have drawn when applying your proprietary mathematical and statistical methods to the study of ancient and medieval history?
The main result that I obtained based on these methods in 1977 to 1979 is that the Scaligerian textbook on ancient and medieval history is the result of combining four practically identical short chronicles, shifted in relation to their medieval original by approximately 333, 1050, and 1800 years. In other words, we used a modern textbook on medieval and ancient history with Scaliger-Petavius datings. It was compiled by merging new sources and guides, textbooks, chronicles, with datings calculated by Petavius and Scaliger. This resulted in a voluminous textbook on traditional history, which we study in schools and universities. This textbook was subjected to the set of methods I briefly mentioned, and it was discovered that this textbook contains duplicates. It is composed of four shorter chronicles. There was one original chronicle. Then, the 17th century chronologists had at their disposal several duplicates of the same chronicle. There were four of them. They were not recognized as describing the same events and were not placed on the timeline as they should have been, i.e., placed on top of each other to recognize them as identical and provide a more complete description of the same epoch. Instead, they were placed with time shifts. One chronicle was left in place, and the other three chronicles were shifted downward by significant amounts. One chronicle was sent into the past by about 300 years, the second chronicle was sent into the past by about 1,000 years, and the third chronicle was sent into the past by a whopping 1,800 years. Only after this were they combined to create a long chronicle, significantly longer than the original short chronicle. The original short chronicle covers events from the 10th century AD to the 17th century AD. This is the short chronicle. Its duplicates, through shifting into the past and joining together, resulted in our modern textbook on ancient and medieval history. In other words, what we study today in schools and universities. This chronicle is erroneous. It contains incorrect dates and a significant number of duplicates. These duplicates were identified using methods I developed with my colleagues. They were separated from this chronicle. When these duplicates were returned to their original positions, moved from the distant past to the epoch from the 10th century AD to the 17th century AD, It turned out that the known written history that is described in the chronicles that have come down to us has been significantly compressed in terms of dates. What we have on our bookshelves, in the libraries, in ancient chronicles and annals, are more or less authentic documents, but they have incorrect dating. After correcting the datings, they all describe events starting approximately from the 10th century AD to the 17th century AD. These documents are not forgeries. They only suffer from erroneous datings that were added to them by chronologists of the 16th and 17th centuries. They should be treated with trust, except for the dates. In the end, we obtain a more comprehensive and significantly shorter genuine history of antiquity. This is what we call the new chronology. This map shown on this graph is a global map, the main result that I obtained from 1974 to 1979, showing the hidden authentic structure of duplicates in the modern textbook on ancient history. We later developed these results using new methods and further research, but at its core lies this map, these 4 chronicles, and 3 shifts that led to a significant distortion of authentic history and its stretching in time by several thousand years. Here's a summary of the methods, not all of them but only the 3 I talked about, and briefly about the results of applying these methods to ancient history material. This result has a formal nature, based on considerations and results of mathematical statistics. It can be cross-checked, and we are responsible for this result. It's like our theorem. The map I created is an objective result and forms the basis of the new chronology. Naturally, we later filled this skeleton of the new chronology with new considerations, including many hypotheses. We always make it clear in our books what belongs to hypotheses and what belongs to mathematically verifiable facts. Therefore, we urge readers and listeners to clearly distinguish established facts from hypotheses, which we always explicitly state as such.
Dear viewers, in a week, we will meet again with the authors of the new chronology and discuss the results of their scientific work. See you on the channel of the Multimedia Museum of the New Chronology.
Thank you for watching.